From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
After months and months of stalled negotiations and deadlock that dragged out past the constitutional deadline, there is a new state budget.
Governor Gretchen Whitmer signed the new $80 billion budget bills yesterday.
After the often contentious process, pretty much all sides are claiming wins.
So House Republicans can say they've helped to shrink state government. Senate Democrats can say they've boosted K-12 school funding and kept free school breakfast and lunch programs.
And Governor Gretchen Whitmer finally got her elusive, albeit smaller, road funding.
But how to pay for that road funding?
A new 24% wholesale tax on marijuana.
But that tax is already facing legal challenges.
On today's show, the legal questions surrounding the new marijuana tax. But first, let's turn to Jen Flood. She's the state's budget director who spent many hours and many days and weeks finalizing this new budget. Director, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Director, the governor said that this was one of the hardest budgets she has ever passed. Why?
Well, we've got a divided legislature for the first time in 15 years. We were facing a road funding cliff. We had a bill passed by the federal government in July that blew a $1 billion hole in our balance sheet and put our Medicaid special financing at risk. So we had a number of challenges to overcome, but we also had leaders with strong priorities that they were passionate about. And so it was a tough negotiation, but we had parties at the table who all care about doing the right thing for our state and our residents. And so we were able to work together to find a win-win for the parties at the table and also the residents of Michigan.
Director, in your negotiations, what's something that you gave up that you would have liked to have seen stay in the budget?
There was a lot of rhetoric around state government and the size of state government and how many people we employ or not. And I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. I know that there are 50,000 state employees who work really hard, no matter where they're working. If they're in their office here in downtown Lansing, if they're a state trooper patrolling the highways or a conservation officer keeping people safe out in state parks, or if they work from home a day or two a week, they could make a lot more money in the private sector. And I know that they're dedicated to making our state a better place. And so some of the rhetoric around the state workforce was hard to swallow. At the end of the day, we ended up doing some right sizing to the number of FTEs that are authorized in state government to align with the number of employees in this moment who are serving the public. But we did that without cutting any essential services, no layoffs. And so I think at the end of the day, it was a good compromise.
Director, you have been around Lansing for so long. You've held so many different jobs and seen so much. What do you make of the rhetoric around state employees? Something that I just don't remember hearing about until recently.
It's a good question. It's hard to say where that comes from. What I know is that there's people who dedicate their lives to the state and work really hard every day to make sure that people have access to health care and that our roads are fixed and that we have state troopers patrolling the highway to keep people safe. And I know they're dedicated to making our state a better place, and we really appreciate their service to the residents.
Director, we have heard there are conversations about the future of economic development incentives. This budget did not contain any new development money for the SOAR fund. That's the state's strategic development fund. And it was something that you and the governor really wanted. What can you tell us about the conversations that are happening about future economic development funding?
We had some really productive conversations with legislators on both sides of the aisle around making sure that we've got the tools to compete for good paying jobs in the economy right now. It turns out that doing a state budget and fixing the roads and protecting Medicaid financing is a lot to do all at once. We got it done, and we have a commitment from the legislative leaders to make sure that we pass bills that give us new tools to create and retain the good paying jobs of the future here in Michigan by the end of the year.
Republican Speaker Matt Hall has said he is committed to finding some kind of a compromise on economic development. What might a compromise look like?
I think at the end of the day, we might come at things from a different philosophy or different approach, but we all care about the same things. I know that all four of the legislative leaders across the street and the appropriations chairs and the governor share an interest in making sure that we have good paying jobs, that our auto sector is set up to thrive, manufacturing. We want to continue to grow R&D jobs. And I know a compromise will make sure that our state remains competitive.
Director Rick brought up Republican House Speaker Matt Hall. This was the first year negotiating with the speaker. What did you learn for next year?
The speaker is a passionate advocate for fixing the roads. I know that he's gone line by line through the state budget and has a deep understanding of what state government funding looks like. And I know that we'll work together again next year to get a budget done, hopefully in June, that funds our state and sets us up for success into the future.
And have there been any conversations about the timeline with the speaker? Of course, the House didn't pass their budget until August. Have there been any conversations about beginning the process earlier?
What I know is that the governor will put out her budget proposal in early February. I'd expect the Senate to stick with their traditional timeline of moving budgets in the spring. And I'm hopeful that House budgets move along that traditional timeline too. There's a statutory deadline for the legislature to submit a budget to the governor by July 1st. And I think everything works better when that timeline is met. We know school districts, local governments, universities all have fiscal years that begin July 1st. And so when the state gets their job done on time, it provides more certainty to everyone else that relies on us. And I'm hopeful that we get it done in June next year.
The budget process this year was unique, to say the least. And we heard from a lot of lawmakers, both parties, during this process. They expressed concerns that they had not actually seen what was in the budget, that they'd only gotten some details, say 24 hours or less before they had to vote. What do you make of what a closed process this turned out to be?
I think this all works better when we move through a more traditional, transparent process on a typical timeline. And so we had some big challenges that we were facing in terms of passing the first state budget with a divided legislature in 15 years, identifying how to address the road funding shortfall and make sure that we draw down $3 billion in Medicaid funding. The final budget document is more than 1,000 pages long. And I think the summary of that document is 80 pages itself. And so as final decisions were made, drafters and the legislature were drafting, and that takes some time. And so I know everyone was looking forward to additional details sooner than they were received. And I'm hopeful next year that we'll have more time for folks to digest all of the components of the budget.
Director, finally, in the last minute that we have, I have to ask. There is some new road funding. It is coming from a new wholesale tax on marijuana. Revenue estimations say that will be $420 million. I see you smiling. You know where I'm going with this. 420 is a number associated with marijuana. Who came up with that?
We landed on a 24% tax on marijuana, which was a compromise. The governor initially came out with something higher. We had lots of discussion, and our landing point was 24% tax, which is lower than alcohol, lower than cigarettes, and happens to generate $420 million in revenue that we're going to use to fix the roads.
Just happened to.
I like that you called it that the governor had a higher number.
That was not intentional, but you're on it, Rick.
That is Jen Flood, Michigan Budget Director. Jen, thanks so much for the time. I know it's been a busy week.
Thanks, Director.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's stay with that new tax on marijuana, this new 24% wholesale tax.
It is controversial, not just because it's a new tax and the legal marijuana industry is unhappy about the increase, but also because there are questions about the actual legality, constitutionality of the tax.
Right. So to explain, let's go back to 2018. That's when voters approved the legalization of marijuana via initiative. It was put on the ballot by a petition campaign. The Michigan Regulation and Taxation of Marijuana Act set some basic rules for the regulation and taxation of marijuana, including a 10% excise tax on retail sales.
So now back to last week when lawmakers approved this new additional 24% wholesale tax. That tax would be paid by retailers before they sell it to marijuana consumers. Critics cried foul.
That is because the Michigan Constitution says in order to change a voter-approved initiative, there has to be a 3/4 majority vote in both chambers of the legislature. There was not.
So Whitmer says the tax increase is legal, but the Michigan cannabis industry filed a lawsuit yesterday seeking a court order to scrap the tax.
We reached out to the association, but they're not doing interviews right now. So instead, we turned to Robert LaBrant for some analysis.
He is a retired constitutional lawyer and elections attorney who is well known in Lansing legal circles.
He knows a lot about the Michigan Constitution and how this could all play out in court. LaBrant started by just reminding us what the state constitution says about changing a voter-approved initiative.
Well, the 1963 Constitution added a requirement that if you were going to change a statutory initiative that was enacted by the voters of the state of Michigan, it would require a 3/4 vote to amend it or another vote of the people. That's the crux of the constitutional issue that will be facing the courts.
And a big question, maybe the biggest question on which this case will turn, will be, was this a substantive change by lawmakers without a 3/4 majority vote to the intent of the voter-initiated Recreational Marijuana Act?
Here's LaBrant again.
With the imposition of a 24% wholesaler tax, you're taking Michigan probably to almost the highest taxation level of recreational marijuana in the nation. And the question is, and I think this is something for the courts to determine, will this basically encourage the sale of marijuana for recreational purposes on the black market? And I think that's probably perhaps one of the strongest arguments as to why this is a very substantive change to recreational marijuana, is that the purpose originally of the 2018 was to kind of get this out of the black market, and by having one of the highest rates of taxation, this is just going to drive a lot of the sales into the black market.
Bob, the actual ballot proposal 1 of 2018, is called the Michigan Regulation and Taxation of Marijuana Act. Does it matter that the word taxation is literally in its title?
Oh, yeah. I think that's an important thing to be stressed in any future litigation, that this was basically sold to the voters of the state of Michigan as a taxation proposal. Although there was a 10% excise tax in there for retail, in addition to the 6% sales tax, all of a sudden we get this 24%, wholesalers tax stacked on top of two other taxes, create this, 40% tax level on the sale of recreational marijuana.
That's the plaintiff's side of the case. What is the state's strongest argument?
That the legislature has this inherent power to create a wholesale tax. This legislation did not specifically go in and amend the retail tax itself, which remains at 10%. And they're going to say that the legislature has this inherent power to create a new tax, a tax that applies to the wholesale purchase of recreational marijuana. that's paid for at the wholesaler's level, not at the retailer's level. And so that's a separate and distinct tax. And that's just one, that's just legislatures do that all the time.
That it doesn't dive in and alter the actual language of the initiative.
That's correct.
Bob, Whitmer, her team, lawmakers seem to be saying, look, our council has advised that this change is constitutional, but they haven't necessarily explained why. Do you have any more insight into why they may not share specifics?
Well, because they were trying to cobble together 56 votes and 19 votes, in the state Senate. So, there's two ways to kind of address this thing. Someone might have asked for an attorney general's opinion, or they could have done the extraordinary measure, and I can see why they didn't, but they could have done the extraordinary measure and basically asked the Michigan Supreme Court for an advisory opinion. If you create a 24% wholesaler's tax, is that separate and distinct from the whole taxation scheme that was created back in 2018 with Proposal 1. So that's one area they could have gone to. We don't know who is this legal guru in the legislature or in the governor's office that basically checked off on this and said, oh, yeah, this is fine. I think this is just an interesting constitutional issue that kind of deserves to be litigated.
And Rick, we got to thinking about just how fascinating it is that we don't actually have answers or court opinions on this already.
Yeah, and Bob LaBrant agrees.
This is an area of law that has not really had that much case law developed on. Prior to the adoption of the 1963 Constitution, there was no provision in the old 1908 Constitution that required a 3/4 vote of the state legislature to amend a statutory initiative adopted by the voters of the state. And my old mentor and law school professor, Tom Downs, I asked him, how did that 3/4 requirement come about? And he says, that was my addition to the Michigan Constitution. I recommended that we have a super majority that would be required to amend a statutory initiative actually adopted by the voters of the state of Michigan. So you'd have to have the 3/4 vote or go back to the voters of the state of Michigan and ask them to either repeal or amend that statutory initiative.
So under the old Constitution, adopt and amend wouldn't have been an issue?
No, not at all.
Bob LaBrant, thank you so much for applying your experience and legal mind to our questions. Much appreciated.
Good talking to you, Rick and Zoe. I enjoyed listening to you on 91.7.
Bob LaBrant, going old school, listening at 91.7 in Ann Arbor, Detroit to Michigan Public. But you are listening to the It's Just Politics podcast. And hey, we would love to see you in person next week, next Wednesday, October 15th. Rick, you and I are going to be in Grand Rapids for our next Issues and Ale. We will be at the Grand Rapids downtown market with a panel of fellow political journalists digging into all of your questions about the state budget, about this new wholesale marijuana tax, really about anything you want to talk about when it comes to the state capitol or, again, all things Michigan politics. Register to attend. It's free, but you do have to register. michiganpublic.org/events. You can also sign up to watch virtually. And that is It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.